Balinese visit. It is an indifferent anchorage at Bololong. The great heights of Bali rise almost sheer from the deep ocean bed. There is a narrow coastal plain on the land, and on the sea, a very much narrower reef. Immediately off the reef, the sea is hundreds of fathoms deep. You have almost to go right up to the reef to find anchorage, and having found it, take good care that the stern of your vessel does not swing into water which at low tide will not float her. Beneath the light structure close to the local slaughterhouse, the anchorage is fair enough in the southeast monsoon. In the other season it would be untenable, but the weather there could not ever be very bad, or the row of flimsy little houses that advanced almost to the water's edge would never have been placed there. They were so small and so fragile that any high wind would knock them down, and one advancing sea would sweep them all into the water. But there they were, and I took encouragement from them. I saw later that the steamers of the KPM that came in always approached the roads with caution, though they came regularly week after week, dragging an anchor on 60 fathoms of chain very slowly, and fetching up sharp as soon as it touched. This it never did until they were close in. Some of the bigger steamers did not anchor at all. Having now arrived, I wondered what manner of reception the vessel would have. I had not previously been in any Dutch East Indies port, and had no special permissions or introductions of any sort. I had none of these things the whole voyage, and indeed never missed them. I knew that, not so very long ago, Holland's East Indian ports had been among the most churlish welcomers of strange vessels. I had some vague idea, or hope rather, that Bali was still to some extent a preserve from odd wanderers and tourists and the like. If it were, I would most certainly respect the restriction, for I wished that voyage to take no part in the spoliation of the few unspoiled native races or islands which might still remain. But I soon found my fears and my hopes alike groundless. There came after due interval an outboard motorboat bearing the honorable clerk to the harbor master, and with him a document 2 yards square to be filled in duplicate, with details of the ship in centimeters and metric tons, and all the firearms on board, and would I be responsible for them, and all the ports the ships had visited, with details of the sicknesses thereat, and this and that, and all the rest of the laborious detail for which ships are now held tribute in all ports. When after 2 hours I had had time to fill in these things, there came the harbor master himself, a pleasant Eurasian, with a demand for 100 guilders from the ship for coming to the anchorage. With him there came a man from the tourist bureau, distributing maps labeled tourist routes in Bali, and wanting to book passengers for round trips of the island by automobile. Lord, I thought, they want tourists, and I had thought this the last unspoiled island. We have 2,000 a month, exclaims the man from the bureau, with great pride, and asked how many of my boys will come on the round trip of the island. It would be, he figured briefly in a little black book. And mentioned a sum that even in gold guilders was most reasonable. The dancing would be 10 guilders extra. We had heard of the Balinese dancing, no. It was very good. Yes, I'd heard of the Balinese dancing, and indeed it is exquisite, he went on joyously, mopping his brow about the delights of a visit to the forest of sacred nutmegs, and the elephant cave, and the second largest banyan tree in all the world. He was a nice young man, he had been a sailor, but my heart sank at his recital, and I found myself, after he had departed, looking sadly upon the tourist maps and things. It is, I suppose, the cruising liners that have done it. There is scarcely a round-the-world cruise these days that does not include a stop at Bali. Ashore in the evening, I saw the Bolong was a Chinese town, Chinese, Arabic, Indian, a place of asphalt streets and shops and temples and motor cars. The clean streets packed densely with Chinese general stores, on the floors of which celestial babies crawled solemnly. Here and there were a row of Hindu haberdashers, or an open establishment sporting an ancient dentist's chair, and a chart of decayed molars, colored and very horrible. One lands in a barbed wire enclosure leading by a gravel path between hotel advertisements to the customs station. Beyond this sanded welcoming place wait the taxi drivers, very quiet and courteous. And I hear when I get back on board that 2 female runners have been out from a local harlotry seeking custom. The connoisseurs report that the place is not so bad, but Bolong is a port. It is not Bali or Balinese. Sooner or later all ports become much the same, offering the same attractions. I stayed 10 days at Bali, cleaning the ship overside and taking in water from a nearby lagoon. Not drinking water, for we were not short of that, but fresh water good enough for other purposes. The boys swam and climbed coconut palms, and went for day trips in lifeboats, rigged for sailing, to Timukhus and Kobotambahan. Looking in at the Sangsit Temple on the way. There were visits to the Balinese theatre at Singaradaj, where an interminable performance rambles on in a large tin-roofed shed surrounded by a native bazaar, and the lavishly dressed actors and actresses, except when they caterwaul, are attractive and good. In the bazaar one may find all kinds of refreshment, from little fried rice cakes to Balinese beer. The rice cakes are not bad, but the beer is like the stuff the natives turn out in the Rarotonga speakeasies at the Cook Islands. All the stalls are covered with old issues of American daily newspapers, which the inhabitants fortunately cannot read. Police quiz Dopey the Wop in Love Nest slang, shrieks the loud headline beneath a bunch of innocent bananas. Flanking the rice cakes is a half-torn page of the same newspaper from which the countenance of a horse-faced man, somewhat bilious, glares beside the sentiment "To hell with Europe." In such fashion, as we survey this animated and pleasant scene, are we reminded of the infinitely superior manner of our living. I made the round the island tour, though I had not set out on this voyage to make conducted tours by motor car round tourist islands. There didn't seem any other way to see anything. I could not leave the ship for long. I could not, when we arrived anywhere, hand over control to a lieutenant and go ashore. I discovered very early that my ship was a grand one for making ocean voyages, but run as I ran her, she was no vessel in which to visit civilized ports. I went on the Bureau's conducted tour to Denpasar, in the south of the island, the royal tombs, the nutmeg forest, and all that. 6 of us in an open car, going by way of Timukhus, Powian, and Tabanan, returning through Bangli and Kintamini. The route lay along good Dutch roads, past labelled villages and tired dogs. We went at speed, for it was a long way. and watched the inoffensive Balinese walking gracefully along the dirt and grass by roadside scurry frightened out of the car's way. If I were Balinese, I should be angry at that. Some of them looked sullen, most indifferent, and many scared. This is their home, their beautiful and lovely home, wherein they have followed their quiet and cultured lives peacefully through many generations. They need neither the motor cars nor the roads, and the gaping sightseers who cavort past bring them no benefit. They stand in need of little we whites can bring. They know how to live, and this is more than we do. The motor car hurries on. How the Balinese work, tilling the rice fields, harvesting, sowing, planting, reaping. Wherever there was a place for a blade of crop to grow, it grew, and where it grew, some Balinese toiled. Along the road they passed in endless procession, men, women, and children, carrying everything on their heads. Here and there among them, near the towns, Chinese coolies ambled heavy laden with that queer shuffling trot that must wear severely on their hearts. But the Balinese do most of the work in the country. In the village compounds some weave, some beat out silverware, some store rice, some are stone masons in the temples. Some repair the homes, some tend fighting cocks that stand in their cages on the best grass of every hamlet. There are, as far as I could see, no drones. Once we saw a troop of children being dressed in their finery and prepared for a ceremonial dance in some temple. Later we saw some of this dancing. At length, with the mountains behind us, we arrived at the town of Denpasar, full of Chinese stores, and came to a very good Dutch hotel, along the open corridors of which stood divers Balinese curios, cloth-carved wooden figures, dance masks, sarongs, kris, with no one exhorting us to buy them. Bali is still a long way from being wholly spoiled. For this the credit is partly Holland's, but must largely be attributed to the innate courtesy and gentleness of the Balinese. There are as yet few beggars and no rackets. True, they have learned to levy small tribute for temple visitings and the like. It cost 10 cents to see the royal tombs, 10 cents for the sacred forest, and so on, which is fair enough. If you do not wish to see these things, no one bothers you, but if you are buying native cloth, it is as well to be sure it was not made in Germany. There are astute merchants who consider the European product superior to their own, and will sell it to you as Balinese with no compunction. I left the gentle Balinese their cloth, for they need it more than we do. The indiscriminate and unintelligent scramble for souvenirs is a poor way to foster local arts. If there is sufficient demand for inferior products, they become more inferior. It has been so in Bali. We arrived at the hotel and ate heartily, but I could not help still thinking of the incongruity of that asphalt road and the motor cars, while I gazed round me at the usual assemblage of globe-trotting Europeans one sees at such places, picking over their food. Their stout woman sent something back, though it seemed grand fare to me, looking blasé, indolent, bored. Why do so many of these round-the-world wanderers wear discontent so heavily upon their features? Is it that what they see in the modes of others living impresses them with the inadequacy of their own? I fear not. It seemed to me then, and the thought became conviction as the voyage progressed, that the sophisticated, perambulating white, dissatisfied with himself, but not knowing why, possessed of every advantage money can bring him, and only dimly aware there is much money will never buy, can be a more harmful and more dangerous influence among native races than the roar of guns. In Bali, as elsewhere, one hears faint whispers of some of these ambassadors of our culture, the homosexuals, the queer, the near insane, the blatant and the foolish, though the worst of them do not come as tourists, but usually with the intention of staying. I tried so far as I could to make my ship an ambassador of intelligent friendship, but in this I found myself more or less alone with the ship and in the ship too. My college boys had not been educated along these lines. I had with me certain young gentlemen who had come only to seek escape, who soon finding that escape was not so easy as they had thought, became troublesome to me. The manner of their living, their rearing, and their education had so hedged them about and surrounded them with the armor of false standards and narrow ideas that they looked upon native life and everything else dimly, afar off, as it were, through frosted glass. What benefit the voyage was to one or two of them I never could discover. They came with great expectation, but prepared to give nothing. One of these noble young gentlemen, expensively educated, born with the traditional silver spoon in his mouth, though it must soon have blackened, had made the voyage, I discovered later, only to have sex relations with as many native women as he could induce to degrade themselves for his amusement. I left him in the first venereal ward we came to stay there for 6 months on his back. It was bad luck, he said. It might have happened to anybody. Even that serious and expensive warning could not penetrate his dulled intelligence. In the evening after the big meal there was a dance, a grand orchestra, a man who expressed grace and rhythm superbly with his hands, little girls sedate and lovely with their supple grace and quiet beauty, and 2 men in masks who harangued each other at great length but utterly beyond my comprehension. The performance was given on a concert stage before the hotel, lit by a solitary electric light. In the best places in front of the stage were ranged the seats of the whites. They sat there staring. Beyond a wired enclosure were the Balinese, hundreds of them, permitted to be there by the grace of the management. Interested and animated, they watched while the heaven-sent sat scowl-faced and overfed, and afterwards discussed the rhythm and meaning of it all. I strolled over to a native bazaar and drank some Balinese beer. In the morning there was a dance in a temple courtyard close to Den Bazaar. Here again the tourists sat and the Balinese stood. The curiously assorted crowd included now a score of Japanese students photographing furiously with German cameras manufactured in their own country, and making copious notes in little books. They were dressed queerly in some kind of European fashion, and were led by a paunchy gentleman of their own race with a cheap cigar drooping from his gross mouth. Behind them stood the Balinese, not many, for most of them were at work. Here stood 2 gnarled and ancient road workers with battered coolie hats, the veins in their legs swollen, and their feet stunted and misshapen from all the years of plodding and of toil. Side-bearded, stalwart, gray, they stood watching the exquisite performance. oblivious of the whites who crowded them from their own temple yard, regardless of the motor cars passing on the road. Along the road, between the cars, the Balinese women walked carrying upright and graceful. In a corner of the temple yard, beneath a tree, a group of little children stood in awe near some of my cadets, watching the dancing with folded arms. A Chinaman went round and round, collecting tribute from the onlookers, 75 cents from those who sat, 25 cents from those who were standing. The Balinese, I was glad to see, were not called on to pay. The beautiful music of the gamelan gong orchestra began again, and I watched the dance. Little girls performing superbly in the temple's dust, barefoot and with wondrous grace. Gold ornamented, richly clad, entranced by the deep symbolism of the music, they danced the age-old interpretations of the ancient legends of their race. There was beauty in their garments and lissome grace in their every posture. Every movement, their beauty and their grace belonged as much to nature as the clouds banked by the south monsoon on the mountains above them, as the swelling trees that rose from the warmth of their Mother Earth. They blended harmoniously with the temple scene. Everything they did, every wave of delicate arm, tread of soft brown foot, posture of graceful body was fraught with meaning. Much of it was lost on me. For I was not conversant with their legends, but I knew that here was the purest form of art. Here were art and beauty hand in hand with life. Beside the road, telephone wires hummed, and going back, the little girls marching home were covered with the motor's dust and did not seem to mind. Poor Bali. I still saw the expression on the road workers' rapt faces as they stood there watching with their machetes, mud-stained, protruding from their rough belts, they and all the Balinese and the blasé whites, looking upon a scene of life and legend which was nothing to them but another change of scene upon the shallow round of a conducted world excursion. Poor Bali, not spoiled yet but soon to be, as every other fair spot upon God's earth has been. Bali, having so much to lose, will suffer more greatly even than Hawaii, Samoa, and Tahiti. I wish the Hollanders, a shrewd and intelligent race, would close Bali to all sightseeing and neurotic whites. We went on to the forest of the sacred nutmeg trees and the holy monkeys. The man from the tourist bureau had said there were 2,000. I counted 20 and saw the mildewed temple deep in the shade, and afterwards the second largest banyan tree in all the earth. Who measures these banyan trees? This one in Bali covered a large field. Here were some Balinese exercising their fighting cocks, which the tourists induced them to fight with crest-like spurs 3 inches long. In a few seconds a white cock lay in the dust, heavily bleeding, and a black cock crowed weakly, also wounded. We did not see much of the tree. Then to other scenes through the villages, with their names hung across the road for the tourists to read. Every village full of temples and of life, and all the roads filled with the burden bearers, bare-breasted women walking erect and gracefully. These women often turned away as the car passed, tired a little maybe of arrogant wide eyes. At Beau Lelong and Denpasar, the roadside merchants hopefully offered large selections of photographs of their womenfolk, half naked and unashamed. Into a little cafe at Den Bazaar came a guide of sorts, speaking some English, inquiring whether we were interested in nice girls' wars. We crossed the mountains in the rain and ate ravenously in the rest house in Kintamani, returning to Bolalong in the evening, a good trip. I did not look at the Elephant's Cave and did not find the royal tombs very enthralling, but as such things go, the trip had been a splendid one, and it was rich in experience. I brought back with me abiding impressions of Bali's intense fertility, of stone figures and temple gates and grassed waysides, shrines, of terraced fields, and the loveliness of scene into which the grace of the Balinese fits so well, and villages, 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 with grand vistas of mountains and valleys and the sea. Here is a lovely island inhabited by a lovely, quiet, and cultured people. I wish I had had the time to stay a while and learn from them, but I had to sail. I had to go on. I had too many people with me, too large a ship, to think of staying anywhere before the completion of the voyage. The man from the tourist bureau, learning that I was going, came out to express his great regret that I could not stay in port until the 12th, when there was to be a very fine cremation. So does the tourist business warp our minds until we think every pious act and ritual of a conquered folk a poppy show to assuage our insatiable lust for entertainment. I sailed. I had no one to be cremated on the morning of the 10th of July, 1935. I weighed anchor and, with the breeze, very quiet off the land, canted her round and stood out to sea, under a full suit of sail. It was clear for once. The Java hills were exposed to the dim outlines of Lombok's great crater could be seen. The sky was cloudless, and we had to wait until the escaping monsoon rushed out from Bali Strait to have a breeze. I then stood slowly towards Sapudi Island and the strait that divides that place from Madura, and there came aft a trio of the college boys, who now found that they had brought with them a souvenir from Bali, which they did not want. I liked Bali. I was glad I went there. It was worth visiting. Even though it is well upon the road towards becoming a kind of Dutch Hawaii. I came almost to like Bolalong. In the end, Bolalong, the port where sometimes 4 steamers called in a day, all loading pigs made up in cane baskets, and discharging oil and general cargoes for the coolies to carry out of the barges and across the beach. The coolies toil almost savagely to land their burdens, wading out waist deep and ashore again, carrying petrol and 5-gallon cans 2 at a time, and huge crates of merchandise. In the background, beneath a wide veranda, sit the little Balinese wives, working, shaking the big baskets of coffee beans, sorting them by hand, day-long, week-long, month-long, for they have no Sundays, erect, graceful little figures in quietly colored coats and loose sarongs. They are a merry gang who work here, though the pay is small, and as they pad softly home in the evenings, they laugh joyously together in the evenings, with the Arabs fishing from the town's small pier, and the bearded merchants from Bombay emerging from meditation at their mosques. Then all the tiny native stalls are open, with the girls seated by their wares, beneath the glare of an oil lamp, always turned up too high, and the happy Balinese, their day's work done, wash in the streams. Once I saw a woman washing a newborn babe, a tiny mite come to a pleasant world, that put out its little hands to grasp the water. In the mornings, very early, the outriggers come from the sea, sailing swiftly in with their fish. At the market the villagers meet to bargain and to discourse. Here food is good and not expensive, and native tobacco may be bought very cheaply, tied up in palm leaves. Fruits are plentiful, and the produce of the land is diverse and excellent. Here 1,000,000 people live, and there is food for all. Beyond the town of Singaradarja, the high mountains rise, the good mountains that stop the monsoon's cloud and bring down rain for the fields. Bali was well organized by nature, and the Balinese long before it was taken by the soldiers of the Dutch. Soldiers who were driven fiercely off more than once before they were finally successful. The island is quiet now and needs no patrolling. The Dutch rule, based as it is, as far as possible, upon non-interference with native life and customs, works very well. They have brought hospitals and some schools, not too many schools, for the Dutch, with their solid sense, saw long ago that book learning is of little use to natives. They have brought roads, motor buses, they have brought the white man, and they have brought tourists. If they take their profit from the island, they also contribute. In any comparison of the white-controlled islands, the Dutch will stand up very well. I leave with the stirring strains of the gamelan gong in my ears, and see again the infinite grace of the small girls dancing. I hope to God no fool is ever permitted to take them away for a season in Hollywood or on Broadway. I sailed through Sapati Strait by night on my way to Singapore to store and clean the ship's bottom for the passage to Australia. From Sapati, I went on across the Java Sea past Balween towards Karimata Strait between the south of Borneo and Billiton Island, and from there stood directly from the Seratu light towards the Strait of Singapore. I should have liked to go to the Kongian Islands and the Tombalons, but there was no time. The run from Bali to Singapore was the quietest and most enjoyable piece of sailing of the whole voyage. Day after day the southeast monsoon blew us quietly along, with beautiful dawns, and the whole long days tranquil and superb. It was hazy and it was hot, but these things did not matter. We rigged up awnings fore and aft, and set a full suit of studding sails on the fore to aid her speed. The little ship sailed beautifully in light winds. Day after day she wandered on, upright and graceful as a Balinese woman walking, with the tiny flying fish flitting before us and porpoises leaping at the bow. One day I put out a boat to look at her, the monsoon being more than ordinarily quiet. She was picturesque and beautiful under her big white sails, with the studding sails making her seem an apparition from the remote past, wandering in this sea first opened by her ancestors hundreds of years before. For all we saw, we might ourselves be living in those days, for day after day showed no ships, no fishing boats, no junks. Sometimes the steamers came, altering their courses to pass close by and dip their ensigns. It is a long time since a full-rigged ship wandered there with single topsails and stunsails set, wandered there or anywhere. We sailed 9 days and crossed the line again, and then picked up the Horsburgh and stood onwards through Singapore Strait towards Singapore. But in the night between the Horsburgh and the Lima Islands, with the monsoon light, the rushing tide came down suddenly, setting us swiftly towards the reef of the Lima Islands. There was barely time to get an anchor over, fetching up all standing, while the muddy water racing past held us steadily at our anchor under all sail. When the day came, I saw that we were almost surrounded by islands, but the tide changed, and it was easy enough then to weigh anchor and get out. We stood on towards the Singapore roads and arrived there that afternoon, coming to anchor in the examination area beside a blue funnel liner. there came a colored gentleman from the office of the harbor master to clear us and tell us to go to another anchorage. But he did not bring our mail. This had been addressed, as in all British ports, in the harbor master's care. At all other ports I was gladly shown this courtesy. But in Singapore there is no harbor master, the title of the all highest occupying this exalted post being the Master Attendant SS, and the Master Attendant SS had our mail returned to the post office. I had previously associated the title of attendant with public works, even more necessary to our well-being than our harbors. What a master attendant was I did not know. At any rate, he did not consider himself a mere harbor master. I shifted the ship to the berth the dark one pointed out in among a number of laid-up steamers off the mole, and hurried to the post office, fearing that 5 months' mail might have been returned to the senders. It had not been, fortunately, but it was about to be. Letters are important when one has been out of touch so long, and there were some hundreds of them for the vessel. I dry-docked at Keppel Harbor and stayed at Singapore 10 days, during which I took in 6 months' stores. These proved to be the best stores bought during the voyage. I had them from a native firm which treated me fairly. At least as far as the firm was concerned, I found Singapore free of the usual ship-chandlery, ship-sharp practices. I gave out lists of my requirements to the firms which sent representatives on board, and chose the one giving me the best prices, and I never had cause to regret this. I had tried to do this in other ports, but it had not got me very far, mainly because the chandler's runners, or the chandlers themselves, worked together. I also spent a considerable sum on the engine, for though we had made our ocean voyages very well, I knew we were about to embark on a totally different kind of sailing, a kind of which I knew little or nothing, but in which the assistance of the engine was almost essential. I was setting out from Singapore to sail north about to Sydney in the wrong monsoon, and this was going to be difficult. In Singapore, it is a great port and an interesting commercial center. It is a far eastern crossroads of which much has been written. I found its streets in the business section well filled with English people, either very pale or very red, most of whom looked as if they usually lived in Golders Green. The streets in the native sections were full of God knows what. There were hotels, tram cars, business houses, and a very good hospital. For a few cents you could buy a good Chinese meal, cooked while you waited in the street. The ship and I made some splendid friends at the Pilots' Association and the Merchant Service Guild. I had the compass readjusted, shipped 2 young people to come with us to Sydney, and very decent they were, and departed from Singapore roads a little before midnight on the last day of July to be out of touch with civilization until we reached Sydney.